It was the winter of 1777, and George Washington was discouraged. The British had just taken Philadelphia. A group of ambitious generals were plotting to overthrow him. There had been letters from the new Congress criticizing and blaming him for recent defeats. His own pleas for help, for more money and better supplies had been ignored, and now his soldiers were suffering terribly. Pennsylvania had been hit by a long, hard winter, and his men were stranded on the bleak, wind-swept hills of Valley Forge. They were half-starved and half-frozen. Many of the soldiers had no shoes, and their sore, cracked feet, wrapped only in rags, left tracks of crimson blood on the deep white snow. Still, they had to work. All day long they cut down trees so they could build log huts for shelter. At night they curled up without blankets and tried to sleep through the iciness and their uncontrollable shivering. Until the huts were finished, Washington stayed close by his men, living in a tent and eating as they did. Then he moved into a small stone house alongside the creek. Martha Washington arrived to spend the winter months with him, as she always did. When the weather permitted, she trudged from hut to hut, carrying a basket of food, visiting the soldiers who were ill. On Sundays, she knitted socks and mended their tattered clothes, along with other women who were braving the winter with their husbands. The winter at Valley Forge was Washington's most dismal experience in the entire war. Never had the battle for independence seemed so hopeless. Never had the morale of his men been so low. But he recognized his duty. He concealed his own despair and cheered his men on. He remained calm and dignified. He continued to organize them, to keep them busy, to reassure them that things would soon improve. And they did. Before long, the seasons changed, and a warm, welcome spring arrived. The snow melted, and so did the despair. For with the spring came the celebratory news that France had agreed to join the United States in its war against England. Even now, the French army was boarding ships for the journey across the Atlantic. It was the turning point in the war, and Washington and everyone else knew it. Ahead lay victory. Even though no battles were fought at Valley Forge, even though nothing was won and no important decisions occurred, it became one of the most famous events in George Washington's life. Valley Forge came to symbolize the qualities that were so uniquely Washingtonian. His calmness, his ability to hold his army together in the most difficult of times, and most of all, his rock-like endurance. Because of these qualities, Washington was the most beloved general of the Revolution, was elected the first president of the United States, and won the grand title, Father of Our Country. His child, the United States of America, saw in him all the attributes it hoped to inherit itself. Those attributes were apparent even when Washington was a child, although many of the stories about his youth are nothing more than myth. The famous story about the cherry tree, where it's claimed he confessed to cutting down the tree rather than lie to his father, is fictional. It was created by an early biographer who made up many other stories in the good but misguided intention of portraying Washington's exceptional honesty and integrity. The true stories are far less dramatic. Washington was a man who didn't come into his glory until he was already in middle age. He was born February 22nd, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, the eldest son of a wealthy landowner who was also named George. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, came from a family of prosperous Virginia gentry, but she had an unhappy childhood. Her parents both died before she reached adolescence, and even though she inherited property from her mother, she never felt financially secure. Mary worried about money her whole life. When Washington was an adult, he received letters from her over and over again, pleading for money she didn't usually need. Washington was raised at first on the family estate on the Potomac River. His early education, probably in a schoolhouse in Fredericksburg, included the classics, geography, surveying, and mathematics, his best subject. He wrote his lessons out in ink on heavy paper, and then his mother sewed them into notebooks. In one of these notebooks, he jotted down his own rules of behavior. Among others, they included, use no reproachful language against anyone, neither curse nor revile. Play not the peacock, looking everywhere about you to see if you be well decked, if your shoes fit well, if your stockings sit neatly, and clothes handsomely. Be not curious to know the affairs of others. neither approach those that speak in private. Washington attended school irregularly for about 7 or 8 years. He never learned as much about literature, history, and foreign languages as many of his contemporaries did, who had more formal educations. By the time he finished with school at the age of about 14 or 15, he could do simple figuring, write clear letters, and keep business accounts. In fact, he loved to keep accounts. His entire life, George Washington kept meticulous records of his purchases, expenses, and income down to the last penny. Most of Washington's early education was in farm life. On the family estate, he helped manage the plantation and learned how to plant and harvest tobacco and other crops. It was here he also developed his lifelong love of horses and riding. Thomas Jefferson later called him the best horseman of his age. As a youth, people described Washington as serious, quiet, and dependable, traits he kept throughout his life. Washington's father died when he was only 11, and he was sent to live with his older brother Lawrence, a wise and affectionate man who owned a house and a large plot of land he called Mount Vernon. When he died some years later, the estate was passed on to George, who cherished it until the day he died. When he was still a young man, Washington chose surveying as a profession, and with the help of influential neighbors, joined a party plotting land in the Shenandoah Valley. With the same help from the same friends, he then landed an appointment as official surveyor for 3 Virginia counties. By then, after hearing many stories about adventure and heroism from militiamen he'd met in the West, Washington had developed an interest in the military. When the English and French were fighting over control of the Ohio Valley, he joined up to fight for the British. In one of these battles, he made his famous comment, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound," prompting King George to dryly respond, "He would not say so had he been used to hear many." Washington commanded a small force in the army, but he didn't command it very well. He made a series of bad maneuvers and eventually had to surrender. But he learned well from his mistakes. He never made the same mistake twice. Washington joined up again 2 years later when the same war reignited, this time serving under Major General Edward Braddock. Once again, the campaign was a disaster. The French launched a surprise attack, wounding Braddock and killing almost all his officers. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him, and 4 bullets ripped through his coat, but he survived unharmed. After Braddock's defeat, Washington was released from service and returned to Mount Vernon. After arriving, he wrote a relative a letter that offered his summary of his military career thus far. "I was employed to go on a journey in winter when I believe few or none would have undertaken it, and what did I get by it? My expenses borne. I then was appointed with trifling pay to conduct a handful of men to the Ohio. What did I get by this? Why, after putting myself to a considerable expense in equipping and providing necessaries for the campaign, I went out, was soundly beaten, lost them all, came in, and had my commission taken from me, or, in other words, my command reduced under pretense of an order from home. I have been on the losing order ever since I entered the service." His country didn't see it the same way. Although he'd experienced defeat, Washington had developed a reputation as the most experienced soldier in America, and a man who was expertly familiar with military organization and function. In appearance, Washington was a man who commanded respect. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong. As he grew older, his face became lined, and he developed a rather stern expression, partly because smiling revealed some defective teeth. When Washington was 20 years old, a friend described him this way: "He's straight as an Indian, measuring about 6 feet 2 inches in his stockings and weighing 175 pounds. A large and straight rather than prominent nose, blue-gray penetrating eyes. He has a clear, though rather colorless pale skin, which burns in the sun, dark brown hair, which he wears in a queue. His mouth is large and generally firmly closed. His movements and gestures are graceful, his walk majestic, and he is a splendid horseman." When he was 27, Washington married Martha Custis, a widow, the mother of 2 children, and one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. It wasn't a marriage based on passion or romance, but seems instead to have been based on happy companionship and mutual temperaments and understanding. The formula was successful. They had a long and very supportive marriage. Washington adopted Martha's children, who were only 6 and 4 years old at the time, and lavished attention and care on them for the rest of their lives. He was heartbroken when the daughter, Patsy, died just before the Revolution. Washington signed his letters to his adopted children and to all his grandchildren as "Your Papa." Martha and George had no children together, but nevertheless they had a very real family. The couple took a 6-week honeymoon, and then Washington moved his new family to Williamsburg, where he served for the first time in a colonial legislature called the House of Burgesses. He'd been away during the election, but he paid the bills for his friends to entertain voters and campaign in his name. During the next 15 years, he was re-elected over and over. Washington seldom made speeches, and he never put any important bills through, but he became an expert on the process of representative government. He knew all the difficulties in getting a law passed, developed patience for the political process, and became acquainted with Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and other future leaders of the fight for independence. Around this time, Washington moved his family to his beloved Mount Vernon. The house and lands had deteriorated in his absence, and he set to work to restore and improve them. He added a greenhouse, a mill, and an ice house, and purchased new land for the estate. He experimented with crop rotation, and when he discovered he couldn't grow the best quality tobacco on his estate, he switched to raising wheat. He also experimented with tree grafting to improve his orchards, and harvested the fish out of the Potomac. Mount Vernon became known for the barrels of salted fish it produced. He bred hunting dogs, horses, and mules. Although a large number of slaves, he was famous for his humane treatment of them. His was one of the few plantations from which slaves seldom tried to escape. He conscientiously fed and clothed them, and hired a doctor whose sole task was to see to their health. Under no circumstances would he sell a slave. He was strongly opposed, as he said, to the traffic in the human species. In fact, Washington was another one of those forefathers, like Jefferson, who opposed slavery completely and yet kept the slaves he'd inherited. There were frequent visitors to Mount Vernon, most of them people Washington had known in the military or the legislature. The men who visited often joined Washington in his favorite sport, fox hunting. In the evening, men and women alike would play cards. Washington often left the plantation to see plays, horse races, to shop, or to attend balls in towns such as Williamsburg, Alexandria, and Annapolis. In these earlier years, he took snuff and smoked a pipe, habits he gave up later on. But he never gave up his love of Madeira wine. While life proceeded happily along at Mount Vernon, in the colonies there was increasing tension over the tyranny of British rule. Washington was one of the first American leaders to consider using force to procure liberties. He wrote in 1769, "No man should scruple or hesitate a moment to use arms in defense of so valuable a blessing, on which all the good and evil of life depends. Yet arms, I would beg to add, should be the last resort." 5 years later, colonists, angry over a British tax on tea, dumped several barrels of the precious stuff into Boston Harbor, and Americans moved yet another step closer to revolution. As punishment, the British closed the harbor entirely. Legislators who protested were thrown out of the legislature. Instead, they met as private citizens and together elected 7 delegates to attend the first Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Washington was one of them. He asked, "Shall we supinely sit and see one province after another fall prey to despotism?" After the first shots of the Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, the Congress geared itself up for what it knew would be a long and difficult war. When his colleagues unanimously voted him Commander-in-Chief of the Revolutionary Army, Washington was dismayed. He hadn't sought the position and was unsure he could live up to their expectations. He told them, "I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that this day I declare with the utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." He also made it clear from the start that he didn't want the $500 a month salary, that he would keep careful track of his expenses but wanted nothing else for his services. That settled, the 43-year-old commander marched forth to fulfill his duty. The Revolutionary War, as heroically as it has gone down in history, got off to a very bad start. He was right when he predicted, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country." By summer soldiers, he meant men who wouldn't be able to bear the hardships of winter, and by sunshine patriots, he meant men who would support the cause only when things were going well. In the next 8 years, Washington would become intimately familiar with both kinds. He would also have to deal with the thousands of colonial loyalists, people who sympathized with the British and refused to help the fight for independence. Throughout the war, Washington seldom had more than 15,000 men to command at one time, and sometimes only 5,000. He described them as raw militia, badly officered, and with no government. There were two kinds of troops in the Revolutionary War, soldiers of the Continental Army and soldiers of the militia. The Continental Army had been organized by Congress. The militia was organized by individual states. Washington had trouble with both. His problem with the Continental Army was that its soldiers kept leaving. They enlisted for only a few months, and when those months were up, they went home. Sometimes 1,000 men would march off into the horizon all at one time. This meant Washington often had to plan his battles for specific dates rather than the time that was strategically best. If he knew the enlistments of many men would be up in December, he would strike in November. If he had a victory, many of them would re-enlist. If he didn't, they fled. Towards the end of the war, Washington finally convinced Congress that the enlistment time had to be longer. The militia, organized by the states, consisted of men who were mostly farmers, shopkeepers, and other private citizens. They were poorly trained, and they easily became homesick or concerned about the crops back on the farm. They complained so much that the soldiers in the Continental Army gave them the nickname Long Faces. Washington suffered many defeats because his militia turned and ran when they saw the redcoats coming. Desertion was such a big problem in the new army that Washington finally initiated severe punishments, such as flogging. Some he even hanged, hoping to make an example of them. At the same time, however, he won the devotion of most of his soldiers for the way he earnestly demanded from Congress that they receive better rations and treatment. His army always felt he was looking after them and willing to endure whatever they had to endure. Once, when a group of officers who hadn't received their pay threatened to march to Philadelphia and take over the government, Washington stopped them, guilelessly, with one simple statement. As he was taking out a letter to read to them, he paused and began searching for his glasses, saying, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown not only gray but almost blind in the service of my country." This comment caused many of the soldiers to begin weeping out of love and respect for their leader, and shame at their own self-interest. One historian later wrote, "With that one sentence, Washington had saved the United States from tyranny and civil discord." The officers were often a problem to Washington, if not in one way, then in another. Many of them were incompetent, and some were appointed without his advice, usually for political reasons. There were even generals who, resentful they hadn't been chosen for Washington's position, refused to obey his orders. A few plotted to take the position away from him, but there was never an organized movement against him. From the beginning of the war right until the end, Washington's troops suffered from a lack of clothing, food, ammunition, and other supplies. If the British had attacked at the beginning in 1775, Washington's men would have had only enough gunpowder to fire 9 shots each. He gave up Philadelphia to the British in 1777, the year of Valley Forge, because he couldn't risk losing the few supplies he had. Because of the lack of clothes and food during the bitter winter at Valley Forge, Washington wrote that his soldiers had suffered such hardships as will not be credited but by those who have been spectators. Conditions didn't improve much, even after the miserable winter in Pennsylvania. A major from New Jersey described the army in 1780, 3 years after Valley Forge. "Poor fellows, they exhibit a picture truly distressing, more than half naked and 2/3 starved. A country overflowing with plenty are now suffering an army, employed for the defense of everything that is dear and valuable, to perish for want of food. This was the army, these were the resources, on which the fate of a new nation, the future of the world's first true democracy, and the hopes of the ideals of liberty and equality so desperately depended. And this is why George Washington became a hero. It was not for his military strategy, which ranged everywhere from brilliant to disastrous. It was because, faced with unbelievable handicaps and hardship, he persevered. He continued to pour energy and faith into the cause, and in the end he achieved victory where few other men could even have achieved sanity. In 1782, a colonel representing several officers in Washington's army sent a document suggesting that the army set up a monarchy with George Washington as king. It was an absurd suggestion, coming from an army that was fighting to form a republic, but it was a measure of the loyalty and confidence Washington had inspired in his men. Washington read the document with what he called abhorrence, and ordered the colonel to, in his words, "Banish these thoughts from your mind." After several defeats and several victories, including the time he crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night and defeated the British at Trenton, New Jersey, Washington's campaign was finally boosted by the arrival of the French army. Together, American and French soldiers marched on Yorktown, Virginia, and cornered the British General Charles Cornwallis, forcing his surrender. It would be 2 years before a peace treaty was signed, but Yorktown effectively put an end to the fighting in the American Revolution. Once the French were involved, the British lost interest in pursuing the war. In 1783, the last British soldiers boarded ships in New York for their return trip to England. A week later, Washington said goodbye to his officers. Then he dropped in on Congress, where he returned his commission and said, "I resign with satisfaction the appointment I accepted with diffidence." Now 51 years old, Washington returned to Mount Vernon to spend Christmas with Martha. For the next 5 years, he lived the happy life of a Virginia planter. He began taking steps to prevent soil erosion. He used the waste materials from his fishing industry as fertilizer. He also broadened his business interests, helping to promote 2 companies that were building canals along the Potomac and James Rivers. And he made a 680-mile trip on horseback into the wilderness to visit his new land holdings southwest of Pittsburgh. What he hadn't foreseen was the steady stream of visitors who would descend on Mount Vernon from all over America and Europe. Both he and his house were famous now, and Washington would never again have the privacy he had had before the war. These visitors, most of whom stayed for dinner, and many of whom stayed overnight, were a constant drain on his finances. In 1787, he wrote in his trusty account book that his estate hadn't been able to make ends meet for the last 11 years. Visitors to Mount Vernon were warmly welcomed and entertained. Washington was always strict about conduct, both his own and others in his command, but he also knew how to enjoy himself. He laughed heartily at jokes, even though he seldom told any himself. He liked to organize house parties, picnics, barbecues, and clam bakes, and there was little he enjoyed as much as dancing. But even in the country, he insisted on wearing clothes of the finest quality: coats, laced waistcoats, hats, and colored silk hose, all imported from London. This idyllic life in the country, which Washington so loved, was to last only 3 years. Once again, America would call him to the service of his country. Within only a few years after the end of the war, the United States was in chaos, as people struggled to understand what their new country meant and fought over their opposing viewpoints. In Massachusetts, there was even open rebellion. It was decided that the nation needed a strong, clear constitution to guide and unite its people. The convention to write the Constitution opened in May of 1786, and the first thing the delegates did was to vote Washington convention president. The debates in that convention were passionate and seemingly endless. Many gave up all hope that any consensus of opinion would ever be reached at all. Washington didn't involve himself in the debates, but he helped hold the convention together, just as he had held his ragged army together. A constitution was finally hammered out, and to everyone's amazement, out of the confusion and conflict had come a document of exquisite beauty and clarity. The majority approved it the following year, and there were few people in America who didn't simply assume that the President of the Convention would also be the President of the newly formed United States. Washington had as much reluctance about accepting this position as he'd had over accepting the post of head of the Revolutionary Army. He said, "If I should be prevailed upon to accept it, the acceptance would be attended with more diffidence and reluctance than I ever experienced before in my life." But prevailed upon he was, by the largest vote possible, and accept it he did. It was his duty. The very first inauguration of our very first president took place on April 30th, 1789 in New York City, accompanied by a 13-gun salute in honor of the original 13 colonies. Washington commented, "I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct that may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." Except in spirit, the America of George Washington's time bore little resemblance to America of today. The new nation was weak and small. Its boundaries stopped at the Mississippi River, and within those boundaries were only 4 million people, most of them farmers. Almost 700,000 of those 4 million people were slaves. Few children went to school, and most adults could neither read nor write. Transportation and communication was agonizingly slow and unreliable. It took 3 days to travel the 90 miles from New York to Philadelphia, the same time it takes now to fly clear around the world. When Washington took office, there were officially only 11 states. 2 colonies had not yet ratified the Constitution. When he left office, there were just 4 more, bringing the total to 15. The Washingtons moved into one of the grandest houses in New York, and then later, when Philadelphia was made the capital, they moved to the finest house in that city. Washington's style of presidency was formal, structured, and somewhat aristocratic. He had a large staff of servants and slaves. Although the Washingtons entertained a great deal, festivities always ended at 9 o'clock, which was the time Washington retired for the night. The exception was his birthday. On February 22nd every year, he gave a grand ball that lasted until midnight. Martha Washington was an excellent hostess. Abigail Adams, wife of the Vice President John Adams, described her this way: "She is plain in her dress, but that plainness is the best of every article. Her hair is white, her teeth beautiful, her person rather short. Her manners are modest and unassuming, dignified and feminine." Washington returned no salutation of greetings from people passing by, and when introduced to people did not shake hands. Instead, he acknowledged them with a formal bow. He drove in a coach drawn by 6 elegant horses, with lackeys dressed in rich livery. When he attended receptions, he was dressed in black velvet suits with gold buckles, yellow gloves, powdered hair, a plume in his hat, and a sword in a white leather scabbard. At dinners, the food and wine was expensive, and the atmosphere was solemn. Many people, including Jefferson, were dismayed at the way Washington conducted himself, saying he acted more like a king at court than a president of a democracy. In fairness to Washington, his behavior had nothing to do with his personal ego and everything to do with his deep respect for the office itself, which he felt should be honored in the highest way. As a president, Washington believed his duties were mostly to administer the laws of Congress and manage relations with other countries. He was an advocate of strong central government, a position that caused conflict with Jefferson, his Secretary of State, and an advocate of strong state rights. Jefferson and his followers eventually formed the Democratic-Republican Party. Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, and a proponent of strong central government like Washington, helped form the Federalist Party. The Federalists were generally represented by Northerners and industrial and banking interests. The Democratic Republicans were generally Southerners with agricultural interests. Already the splits in interests that would later lead to the Civil War were bubbling to the surface. The conflicts between Hamilton and Jefferson were so intense that Jefferson several times tried to resign. Washington never affiliated himself with either party, but he generally supported Hamilton's views to the despair of Jefferson. As the division between these two parties became sharper, Washington grew more and more exasperated. When his terms of office were completed, he was filled with relief. It was always Washington's plan to retire after his first term. In fact, he wrote his farewell address early in his last year of office. But almost every leader in the country begged him to continue. Even Jefferson, who wrote to him, "Your being at the helm will be more than an answer to every argument which can be used to alarm and lead the people in any quarter into violence and secession. North and South will hang together if they have you to hang on." Washington stayed, but when they tried to recruit him for a third time, he adamantly refused. Of his two administrations, it was the second that was the most challenging and noteworthy. He struggled to keep America neutral in the war between France and England in 1793, and tried to establish a precedent for non-involvement in foreign conflicts that he hoped Americans would adopt as policy. This neutrality was criticized by many Americans, including Jefferson, who felt we should honor an earlier alliance we'd signed with France. Washington's second crisis was a domestic one, the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, where farmers in Pennsylvania refused to pay federal taxes on the manufacturing of whiskey, armed themselves, and attacked federal officers. Washington's response was swift and uncompromising. He sent in 13,000 troops to crush the rebellion and had all its leaders arrested. It was the first demonstration that the federal government could and would enforce its laws in the states. One of the most difficult and controversial events of Washington's administration was a treaty he signed with Britain called the Jay Treaty, after the Chief Justice he had sent to London to settle problems between the two nations. The British had been interfering with America's ships at sea, even seizing their cargoes and forcing their sailors into the British Navy. They'd also been stirring up Indian fighting on the western frontier. To many, particularly the Democratic Republicans, Washington had given up too much in signing the Jay Treaty, which restricted American trade in some ways. There was bitter criticism, and some even suggested his impeachment. Washington was deeply hurt, a hurt from which he never fully recovered. He'd always felt that the office of the presidency should be above political attack, and now he found himself completely weary of public office. When he retired at the end of his office in 1797, it was with relief that approached triumph. He returned once again to Mount Vernon, as he'd done so often in his life, and happily wrote, "Unless someone pops in unexpectedly, Mrs. Washington and myself will do what has not been done within the last 20 years. That is to sit down to dinner by ourselves." Washington was now 65 years old. He slipped into a contented routine that included rising at dawn, breakfast at 7, riding around his farm, luncheon, then a walk followed by tea, then writing and correspondence, and bed as usual at 9. Riding was still Washington's greatest pleasure, and not a day went by when he didn't spend a few hours on horseback, surveying his crops and his field hands. He rode, no matter what the weather, so on December 12, 1799, he mounted his horse as usual, even though the day was icy cold, and the snow had turned into rain and sleet. He returned after about 5 hours and sat down to dinner, his clothes still wet. The next morning he awoke with a painful sore throat. Nevertheless, he took his customary walk and then returned home to make the last entry in his diary. It read, "Morning snow and about 3 inches deep. Mercury 28 at night." That night Washington woke Martha up at 2 a.m. because he was feeling very ill and could hardly speak. However, he refused to let her call a doctor until dawn. When the doctor arrived, he performed the usual medical procedures for the time. Washington was bled 4 different times, was given a gargle of molasses, vinegar, and butter, and a poultice was applied to his throat that consisted of dried-up beetles. Today, doctors believe Washington was suffering from a strep infection and acute laryngitis. By the afternoon, there were 3 doctors on hand, and Washington was only growing worse. He said, "You had better not take any more trouble about me, but let me go off quietly. I cannot last long." He lasted until that night. About 10 p.m. on December 14th, Washington whispered, "I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put in the vault in less than 2 days after I am dead. Do you understand me?" When his secretary answered yes, Washington said, "'Tis well." He felt for his own pulse, and then he died. He was 67 years old. There was a military funeral for Washington, and then his body was laid to rest in the family tomb at Mount Vernon. People throughout the world mourned his passing, but in the United States the grief was so profound that many people wore mourning clothes for several months. Thomas Jefferson, writing about Washington after his death, said, "His mind was great and powerful. As far as he saw, no judgment was ever sounder. It was slow in operation, being little aided by invention or imagination, but sure in conclusion. Perhaps the strongest feature in his character was prudence, never acting until every circumstance, every consideration, was maturely weighed. Refraining if he saw a doubt, but when once decided, going through with his purpose, whatever obstacles opposed. His integrity was most pure, his justice the most inflexible I have ever known. He was indeed, in every sense of the words, a wise, a good, and a great man. On the whole, his character was, in its mass, perfect. It may truly be said that never did nature and fortune combine more perfectly to make a man great. Of the men who led America through its revolution and its birth as a new nation, the men we call our forefathers, it seems sometimes as if they can be divided into two types. On the one hand were the learned men, highly educated, extensively read, with refined intellects and analytical minds. Sometimes, like Thomas Jefferson, these men were admirers of French culture and kept an interest in European affairs. They were men of ideas and imagination who would give the Revolution its eloquent language and ideology. They were often impassioned, persuasive, and confident about the nobility and future of their great cause. George Washington was a different kind of man. He had little schooling and made minimal effort to educate himself further. He preferred to use his free time not in reading books, but in manly pastimes like riding, hunting, fishing, farming, and playing cards or billiards. Although he could occasionally give a moving speech, Washington was neither a great orator nor a notable writer. Arguments and political debates frequently annoyed him, and he seldom involved himself in either. He was already middle-aged when the Revolution started, older than almost all the other forefathers except Ben Franklin. His main fame had been as a military man, and there his greatest asset was considered to be his stern discipline. Cautious and careful, he weighed every fact and opinion before making a decision. Where others acted on passion, he acted on common sense. He was an excellent administrator and an effective organizer. George Washington was solid, reliable, poised, and possessed an enormous amount of both energy and endurance. The others gave us the lofty ideals. Washington gave us the ground to stand on. Together, it was the perfect balance. There were three key roles Washington played in the shaping of the United States. He commanded the army that won American independence from Great Britain. He served as president of the convention that wrote the Constitution, and he was elected the first president of the United States. But just as importantly, as father of the country, he helped to model its new character. The perseverance, the integrity, and the sensible approach to conflict and adversity that distinguished George Washington came to reflect America itself. Just as he was to the people of his own time, he remains a symbol of what it was we fought for and what we struggle to preserve.